The neighborhood had always seemed peaceful to outsiders, a quiet suburban community where the lawns stayed trimmed, fences were painted the same shade of beige, and everyone pretended to live in harmony under the strict eyes of the homeowners association. But those who actually lived there knew the truth: the peace was artificial, held together by layers of control, unreasonable rules, and an HOA board that thrived on power. And at the top of that power pyramid was the HOA president, a woman who believed she owned the entire neighborhood simply because she held a clipboard and a list of fines. When I moved into the community 3 years earlier, I had no idea what I was stepping into. I wanted a quiet place, a fresh start, and a chance to build a home where my work-from-home lifestyle would not bother anyone. But the HOA quickly made it clear that they had other plans. It started small, with letters reminding me about tiny details: my trash bin being an inch too close to the street, my mailbox needing a more compliant paint shade, and my grass allegedly growing a little too fast after a rainstorm. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking it was nothing more than routine oversight. But then the letters became warnings, and the warnings became fines. By the time the first year ended, I had collected more HOA letters than most families gathered in 5 years. The neighbors told me that once the board targeted someone, they rarely stopped. They picked one house, pushed them, squeezed them, and waited for them to break, sell, or move away. It was how they maintained control, through pressure and persistence. And apparently, I had become their new target for reasons I couldn't yet understand. Everything escalated when I decided to build a small shed in my backyard. The shed was within all legal limits and was built exactly according to county regulations. But the HOA claimed it violated their architectural harmony standards, a vague rule they used whenever they simply wanted to say no. They fined me daily, threatened legal action, and even attempted to enter my property for inspection. It was the first time I realized that this battle wasn't about rules, it was about power. I filed appeals, submitted documents, and even hired an inspector to confirm that everything about the shed was lawful. But the HOA dismissed it all, insisting that their rules were final. They continued piling on fines, and soon the amount reached a level that no reasonable person could simply ignore. They expected me to fold, to remove the shed, and to accept their control like everyone else. But I refused. And once I refused, the HOA decided to escalate things even further. The president started showing up in front of my house every few days, her arms crossed, staring at my property as if she was waiting for me to break. She claimed she had the authority to issue direct enforcement inspection notices, and sent me threats of liens. At that point, the harassment had become too blatant to ignore. My patience slowly turned into frustration, and frustration into determination. If they wanted a battle, I would give them one. But not the kind they expected. I began documenting everything: the fines, the threats, the letters, and even the president's unscheduled visits. I consulted a lawyer and discovered something the HOA hadn't expected I would find: most of their fines and rules were unenforceable. In fact, several of their so-called regulations had expired years earlier and were never renewed properly. Their entire enforcement process was a mess of outdated paperwork and illegal authority. But I didn't reveal what I knew, not yet. Instead, I let them continue. I let them fine me, threaten me, and act as though they controlled every inch of my property. Because the more they pushed, the stronger my case grew. And the more my evidence piled up, the more I realized this wasn't just about stopping their harassment, it was about exposing the entire HOA. The breaking point came when they issued a massive fine for unauthorized exterior modifications, claiming that my garden lights, solar lights I had installed for a safer walkway, were visually disruptive. It was laughable, but the fine itself was thousands of dollars. They clearly thought I would finally crumble under the pressure. But instead, I felt something shift inside me. The fear they relied on no longer worked. They wanted a victory, but what they didn't know was that I had already begun planning their downfall. I filed formal complaints with the county, gathered statements from neighbors they had also harassed, and prepared a legal challenge that would expose every flaw in their system. The HOA board had no idea that their endless push for control was about to backfire horribly. And as they prepared to send me another stack of fines and threats, I prepared the one move they would never see coming. Because while they were trying to break me with pressure, I was quietly setting up the move that would force them to pay, more than they ever expected. The HOA believed they had me cornered. Every week, a new envelope appeared on my doorstep with another accusation, another invented violation, another number added to the growing mountain of fines they insisted I owed. They thought their intimidation would eventually force me into compliance or bankruptcy. But while they were busy piling on pressure, I was quietly turning that pressure into leverage. The evidence I had gathered over the months was no longer just a collection of papers. It had transformed into a map, a clear picture of corruption, procedural violations, illegal enforcement tactics, and abuse of power. The HOA had made a habit of bending their own rules so often that they forgot the rules even existed. They operated on fear instead of policy, through pressure instead of procedure. And while most residents let the board control them out of exhaustion or convenience, I had no intention of becoming another silent casualty. The county investigator's visit marked the first shift in momentum. The HOA board wasn't expecting it, and when the investigator arrived to review their documentation, their panic became obvious. They scrambled to organize files that hadn't been updated in years. Their so-called architectural authority had expired without renewal. Their inspection procedures violated multiple housing statutes. Even the fines they issued were inconsistent, with numbers pulled seemingly from thin air. The investigator didn't reveal much during the visit, but the expression on his face said enough. The HOA had overstepped, and they were about to face consequences. But even as the investigation progressed, I didn't stop building my case. I had learned over time that power organizations rarely collapsed in a single blow. They cracked slowly, piece by piece, until the structure gave way. Over a dozen residents came forward, each with a story of unfair treatment, harassment, or sudden fines issued without warning. A few had even considered moving just to escape the constant pressure. The HOA had created an environment where people lived under silent tension, afraid that the smallest misstep would lead to punishment. One neighbor told me about how he was fined for leaving holiday lights up 2 days past the deadline, despite the fact that he had been out of the country and had notified the HOA in advance. Another described how the board denied her backyard renovation 3 times, even though similar projects had been approved for board members' friends. Each story was more revealing than the last, painting a picture of favoritism, weaponized rules, and targeted control. I compiled every account into a detailed report and submitted it to both my lawyer and the county. The pieces were aligning perfectly, but I still needed one more thing, a reason for the HOA to act recklessly once more. I needed them to push, to overreach, to make a mistake that would finalize everything. And as if on cue, the HOA president delivered exactly what I needed. It happened on a quiet Thursday morning. I was working at home when I heard movement near my backyard. When I stepped outside, I saw the HOA president walking around behind my house with a clipboard in hand, taking photos and jotting down notes. She hadn't knocked, hadn't called, and hadn't provided any notice. She was trespassing, and she didn't even attempt to hide it. When she finally noticed me, she simply turned and walked away, acting as if she had every right to enter private property whenever she wanted. But what she didn't know was that her actions were caught on my security cameras, clear footage showing her violating both state law and the HOA's own governing documents. Board itself. Less than an hour after they received it, the board held an emergency meeting, one they didn't invite me to but that I knew would be filled with panic and frantic attempts to control the fallout. But I wasn't done. I had one more move prepared, a move that would shift the balance entirely in my favor. Using the evidence of harassment, illegal entry, improper fines, and procedural violations, I filed a formal demand for arbitration, a process the HOA could not avoid. Arbitration would force them to present every piece of evidence they had ever used against me. They would have to justify every fine, every warning, every letter, and every action. And once they presented it, the contradictions in their process would unravel. As word of the investigation spread, residents began to whisper. The board, once feared, now looked uncertain. They cancelled inspections, paused fines, and even attempted to revise old rules, an act that further revealed their guilt. Their confidence was cracking, and the pressure they had once directed toward me was now directed inward, as they scrambled to hide just how much they had crossed the line. 2 weeks later, the county released preliminary findings. The HOA had violated multiple housing regulations, issued unenforceable fines, and imposed illegal inspections. The investigators' report mentioned misuse of authority and procedural negligence, phrases that struck fear into any HOA's leadership. The board was instructed to halt all enforcement actions pending a full review. Their power was effectively suspended. And yet, the biggest blow was still ahead. Because arbitration wasn't just about clearing my name, it was about financial accountability. For every illegal action the HOA took, there was a cost: statutory damages, legal fees, compensation for stress and harassment, and potential penalties for wrongful conduct. My lawyer estimated that the total amount could reach numbers the board had never imagined. The HOA tried one last desperate move by offering a settlement that cleared my fines but required me to drop all claims. It was their attempt to escape the storm before it hit. But I refused. They had spent years intimidating residents, weaponizing rules, and abusing authority. Simply wiping my fines wasn't justice, it was avoiding consequences. And so, the arbitration date was set. The HOA would be forced to stand in front of a neutral judge and defend their actions. My evidence was overwhelming, and they knew it. The board members who once held clipboards like swords now held emergency meetings in whispered panic, trying to determine how much damage they had caused themselves. But they still didn't know the full extent of my final move, one I had saved for the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. A move that wouldn't just expose them, but forced them to pay far more than they ever expected. The morning of arbitration arrived quietly, almost deceptively so. The sun rose over the neighborhood in its usual calm manner, casting long shadows across the identical houses, but beneath that calm was an unavoidable tension. The HOA board members who had once walked the community with confidence now arrived early, heads low, whispers sharp. They carried folders thick with paperwork, papers they hoped would shield them from the consequences they had spent years avoiding. But deep down, they knew that their defenses were thin, the cracks in their authority too wide to cover. I showed up with my lawyer and a box containing every piece of evidence I had collected. Months of documentation, recordings, statements, county findings, and legal analyses were organized neatly inside. The board looked at that box with dread, because they recognized it, not as paperwork, but as the weight of their own actions returning to them. I took my seat, silent and steady, knowing that everything I had worked toward was about to unfold. Arbitration began with a review of the HOA's fines and enforcement history. The arbitrator, a neutral party appointed by the county, flipped through the documents the board presented. As he read their justifications, his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion, and eventually to disbelief. Many fines had no legal basis. Some had been issued under rules that had expired years earlier. Others had been created without membership approval, making them unenforceable from the moment they were written. The HOA president attempted to explain each inconsistency, but her explanations only dug a deeper hole. She blamed administrative errors, claimed misunderstandings, and tried to shift responsibility to past boards. But none of it changed the fact that the current board had continued to enforce rules they had no authority to enforce. The arbitrator took meticulous notes, and every word she spoke became another thread unraveling their case. When it was my turn, my lawyer presented the evidence systematically. We began with the illegal inspections, including the footage showing the HOA president trespassing on my property. The room fell into a heavy silence as the video played, the president stepping into my backyard, clipboard in hand, taking unauthorized photos. Her face tightened as she watched herself on the screen, knowing that the moment had become undeniable proof against her. Next came the county investigators' findings. The report was devastating, improper governance procedures, lack of compliance with state statutes, discriminatory enforcement, inconsistent fine structures, and multiple violations of housing rights. It became clear that the HOA's power had not been built on structure or legality, it had been built on intimidation and habit. Then came the testimonies from neighbors. While they were not present, their statements painted a vivid picture of long-term harassment disguised as community regulation. The arbitrator studied each one, noting the patterns of behavior, targeted enforcement against certain homeowners, leniency for the board's friends, arbitrary fines that fluctuated without explanation. With every page, every document, every recorded detail, the board's confidence collapsed further. By the time the presentation ended, they looked exhausted, people who finally realized the consequences of the authority they had misused. But the proceedings were far from over. The arbitrator asked the HOA to provide evidence that they had properly renewed their governing rules, as required by state law. The board members shifted uncomfortably. They had no such evidence. Their governing documents, in fact, had expired nearly 4 years earlier. Without valid governing documents, they had no legal right to enforce most of their rules or fines. Their authority had technically dissolved long before they issued the first violation against me. That revelation shattered whatever defense they thought they had left. The arbitrator leaned back, absorbing the information, and then began outlining the consequences. Every fine issued under expired rules was invalid. Every threat, warning, and enforcement action was void. The HOA had not only overstepped, they had acted without legal authority for years. The room felt heavy, the truth settling on the board like a weight they could no longer carry. But the most significant part of the process was still ahead. Arbitration wasn't just about acknowledging wrongdoing, it was about remedying it. And that was where my final move came into play. My lawyer presented a financial claim that included statutory damages for harassment, compensation for stress and time lost, reimbursement for legal expenses, and penalties associated with unlawful enforcement. The total amount stunned the room. It wasn't simply a small payout. It was a sum that represented every moment the HOA had tried to force me into submission, every letter, every fine, and every act of intimidation. The HOA president attempted to argue, but the arbitrator stopped her. The evidence, the report, and the recorded actions spoke louder than her excuses. After hours of review, he issued the decision: the HOA was required to pay the full amount, not a reduced version, not a negotiated settlement, but the entire sum. It was a ruling that struck the board harder than any penalty they had ever issued. The moment the decision was read aloud, the president lowered her head. The rest of the board sat frozen, realizing the financial consequences they had never prepared for. Years of unchecked power had finally produced the bill they never imagined they'd have to pay. But my final move didn't end with arbitration. I had already coordinated with a group of neighbors who were fed up with the HOA's behavior. With the board weakened and publicly embarrassed, we organized a special community vote to remove the entire board from their positions. The turnout was overwhelming. Families who had stayed silent out of fear now cast their votes with renewed confidence. The board members who had once treated the neighborhood like their personal kingdom were voted out in a sweeping majority. A new board was elected, one committed to rebuilding trust, revising the rules properly, and restoring a sense of fairness to the community. They approached me personally, not with intimidation, but with respect. They apologized for what had happened, acknowledged the damage caused, and assured me that the HOA would operate legally and transparently moving forward. For the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the artificial kind the old board pretended to maintain, but genuine peace, the kind that comes from knowing that the system finally worked as it should. The settlement funds were deposited shortly afterward. It was more than the HOA had ever expected to pay, and more than I had expected to receive. But it wasn't the money that mattered most. It was the principle, the justice, and the message sent to any future board: authority is a responsibility, not a weapon. As I stood in my backyard that evening, watching the sun dip below the newly quiet neighborhood, I realized something. The HOA had spent years trying to force me into submission. But in the end, it was their own actions, their own arrogance, and their own disregard for the rules that brought them down. My final move had forced them to pay, not just financially, but with every ounce of power they believed they would never lose.